Hello, everyone, and welcome to your weekly news recap. We are your hosts, Jacob Smith,
and Matt Morgans,
here to break down some of the biggest and most interesting stories of the week in the gaming industry. So far, our plans for the future of this podcast are to expand into video content as well as webcam footage to make this all the more engaging.
Hopefully, sooner the better.
Indeed. We're also looking to answer audience questions to implement audience feedback. So if you've got any of either, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. And to kick our week off, Matt, you've got some news about what's happening on the God of War anniversary.
Indeed. Well, it's just been announced that it's God of War's 1-year anniversary since their highly successful launch last year.
Yay!
And indeed, and to celebrate the occasion, they're doing quite a lot to kind of remind people just how successful the game was. They released a new trailer, which is very much kind of in the style of accolade trailers that we've seen from some games in the past, where it was really a trailer for the game that came out a year ago, but interspersed with some of the more kind of positive comments from high-profile reviews, and also like all the awards they've won, like the fact that they've won over 190 different Game of the Year awards, which is pretty impressive.
It's a well-deserved pat on the back, clearly.
Absolutely. And they're also taking the opportunity they're launching a new line of God of War merchandise with, I think it's Mondo is the retailer who's involved with that. And just today they've announced they're going to release a new documentary called Raising Kratos, which is going to be about the 5-year development of the most recent God of War, and really the process that went into tearing down the old franchise and rebuilding it as what launched last year.
Yeah.
No release date on that as of yet, but they've said it's going to be coming soon.
That is exciting. To me, the idea of the Raising Kratos series, the idea of a dev diary, kind of takes me back to like the early 2000s of gaming. Takes me back what I think of when I think of dev diaries is like Bungie working on Halo 3 is the first one that I really watched when I was growing up. And so I like that. I think it's a callback to getting really personal with development teams.
They did do a series of interviews with NoClip, who released it as sort of a pseudo documentary. This time around, from what they announced, this is going to be what they term a full-length feature documentary. So
nice.
We don't know exactly how long it's going to be, but I would guess maybe in the region of an hour or more. And it'll be releasing. It'll be releasing for free on PlayStation's YouTube channel.
Nice. That's gonna be a lot of fun. I really like Cory Barlog as a director. I like what he's done. I think he's an easy guy to like, especially if you've really followed God of War, especially this most recent title. Especially, they worked really hard to rework the image of Kratos, the image of those games, and I mean clearly it paid off. But it's gonna be fun to see that kind of fully realized in the documentary.
Absolutely.
I think it's something that we need to see more of, especially in an era where we are getting really intimate with the idea of development teams enduring crunch and enduring these hardships. I think it's nice to get an inside look, a real window into the life of a development team over the course of a development period, which is not short. 5 years is a long time to develop a game, a good amount of time to develop a current gen game, but a long time to invest.
I think a big part of that development, obviously there were multiple factors behind it, but if I recall correctly, a big part of it was because they had to rebuild the engine from scratch.
Yeah.
And so they were saying, or they said in an interview at some point last year, that the development time for subsequent games should be much shorter because they've now got the engine. So the rumours are that they're already working on a sequel to last year's God of War, so hopefully it won't take 5 years for that one to come. Hopefully it'll be more like in the next year to 3 years.
I think everyone's hoping for probably the soonest release date possible.
Yeah, certainly.
But kind of thinking on release dates, we move into the really big news that broke last week, which was details about the PS5.
At last.
Tentative title, of course. We don't know exactly what that's going to be called, but if they didn't call it the PS5, I'd be surprised.
I think most people would be surprised. They've had fairly consistent naming trends, unlike Microsoft.
Yeah. Hail back to the 720 that was not. But I think PS5 is a good name, so I think they should definitely stick with it. But beyond that, Mark Cerny sat down and spoke to Wired. He was the lead PS4 architect, so this dude built PS4 from the ground up, and talked about the supposed specs of the machine, because as we know from reports going out, mid to late last year, there were development kits being sent out to developers, to studios, to start developing games for the PS5.
Yes.
So we know it's a functioning console that developers can work with. And the details around it are pretty staggering. First and foremost, the biggest news about it is the use of a solid-state drive. For those who don't know, that is basically a piece of hardware which helps everything, primarily PCs, to run ridiculously quickly, much more quickly than your standard piece of hardware does. And Cerny is claiming that this SSD is more powerful than any SSD currently on the market. What are your thoughts around that? What are your thoughts around the viability of that?
Well, it's a very interesting claim. I mean, I don't think he'd come out and say something that wasn't correct. I would expect that it's probably not wildly better than anything on the market at the moment. It's probably, if it is better, it's probably just a bit better. Especially because it's going to be going into a console and it needs to be somewhat affordable.
Certainly, yeah.
And unless they're planning to take a loss on console sales, which seems very, very unlikely. But I think it's the natural progression for consoles. Things like graphics technology are moving forward very quickly at the moment, and while PCs can fairly easily keep up with that, by swapping in and out components, obviously a console is going to be a much longer investment. Typically you'll buy a console for 5-10 years, and in that time things can change dramatically. I think we're really in that period of the current life cycle of consoles where the hardware of the console is really starting to hold things back.
It's showing its age. Absolutely.
Yes, I remember I think it was early this year, or maybe it was late last year, Detroit Become Human announced that they were going to add a photo mode, and then shortly afterwards, I think it was like a month or two after, they came out and said, actually, we can't put in a photo mode because we literally can't fit it anywhere. Like, we've pushed the console capabilities to the absolute maximum. We literally can't spare the memory to put in a photo mode.
Yeah, so I think, this is a good example of Sony future-proofing their console. I mean, feasibly, they want to make this last longer if it is going to be a more expensive machine, which further details surrounding the specs indicate that is true. For example, the load times on these things are apparently absolutely staggering, blisteringly quick.
Fantastic news.
Cerny, yeah, exactly, right? I think that's the main kind of complaint around consoles is load times are on big games, which games are just getting bigger. But Cerny said that in a development kit, PS4 or PS5, they played Spider-Man, most recent Spider-Man, and they cut the fast travel load time from 18 seconds to a whopping eighth of a second.
Good lord, that's gonna be fun.
I mean, that is wild. And granted, games are just gonna keep getting bigger, so that might boost up to a second, a couple seconds, but that SSD is working hard like a horse. I mean, if that is the case, additionally, and met with some skepticism, is the announcement of ray tracing present in the PS5, which is something that not even a lot of PCs can keep up with right now.
Yes,
that is a very expensive, very high-tech way of rendering graphics. It basically
it's currently only available on NVIDIA's RTX graphics cards, which are
it's really exclusive.
Line. They are not cheap, to put it lightly.
No.
Although they have they've recently put out a new, slightly cheaper version. Even that is still very expensive.
Well, and that'll help render, things like liquid and cloth and shadows in much higher detail and resolution.
Yes, it doesn't surprise me to see them say that ray tracing was coming, because ray tracing I've heard it said by people in the industry that ray tracing is sort of like the big kind of jump forward for the graphics technology in the last few years.
Yeah.
This was going to be the big new milestone, and if they're releasing new consoles, it seems like the kind of thing they'd need to future-proof for, because we're already seeing games come out with ray tracing on PC. I think there's probably less than 50 games currently have ray tracing in them.
Wow.
But that number is rapidly growing, and there's not a lot holding developers back from releasing with ray tracing at this point. And so if you're planning consoles to run for the next 5 to 10 years, you really need to have ray tracing in. Otherwise, you've got to commit to not having ray tracing until a few years down the line when they release the equivalent of the PS4 Pro for the PS5.
Yeah, and I think that's another case of future-proofing, right? Because they don't want it. Consoles have to strike an interesting balance of being able to relatively keep pace with what PCs can do. I say relatively because that hasn't been seen in the current gen, but they can keep relative pace. Developers.
I'd say with kind of like mid-range PCs.
Yeah.
I mean, no one's expecting consoles to keep pace with like top-of-the-line PCs because they're just monumentally more expensive.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing is consoles and console manufacturers and publishers like Sony have to work hard to not bring that price point up to the range of high-end PCs while still trying to compete with those graphics.
Exactly.
Because price is still unknown about the PS4, but it's looking to be on the expensive side, just judging by these features alone. Who knows? Maybe they can find a way to make it really cost efficient. But I think that
we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we will absolutely, and we won't get any information at E3 because Sony won't be there.
Yes, although Microsoft, I believe, did come out with some E3 news.
They did. Really, just announced their conference date set for June 9th, and that's about all they can say because they don't want to, give everything away before E3.
Exactly. I think if Microsoft's planning to reveal stuff for their new console at E3, it probably won't be long before we hear stuff about the next PlayStation, because Sony won't want to let Microsoft kind of dominate the conversation about the next console generation.
No, and I think that's why they've gotten their foot in the door with this announcement, is to kind of not only get ahead of Microsoft, but say, we've got something, it's coming. But beyond that, just some little details. Microsoft announced the Xbox One S discless version at $250, which is nothing really remarkable. I mean, it kind of shows their vision for the future, I suppose, with one of their console options, as has been rumored for a while, that their next generation will feature a disc-inclusive and discless set of consoles.
Yeah,
but
that seems to me the sensible way to go, because I think discless is the way that the console kind of industry is moving, but I don't think that the audience is really quite ready to kind of give up a disc completely.
No.
So having the two options there, I think, is a wise way to kind of let people get what they want.
Definitely.
Because we are seeing a trend of people increasingly moving away from discs, so that trend should naturally continue into the next console generation, and then by the time we get to another generation beyond that, then we may be at the point of discless being the norm. Or I think maybe Google Stadia will have taken over.
Or Apple Arcade.
Who knows?
But I think that's a good indicator that Microsoft is actually listening to the community, because gamers have been very adamant about not wanting exclusively discless consoles.
Yes, certainly.
So that's encouraging to see that they've learned from their past mistakes regarding the launch of the Xbox One. But additional smaller details about the PS4. It's not coming in 2019, to the surprise of no one.
Exactly.
And it is backwards compatible, as discovered by patents filed by Sony, right? And it's a good indicator, again, that it will be a disc-inclusive console, because they wouldn't make it backwards compatible and then say, well, you got to buy your games all over again, or you can only download them.
I think backwards compatibility is going to be the norm for the next console generation, because there's just been too many kind of really big, really popular titles, and especially because it would mean the really big games as a service games having to re-release on new consoles. We'd get like Epic Games releasing Fortnite again, but for the new console, and I'm sure the developers don't want to have to go through that.
Probably not.
With games as a service being the dominant force, I think console makers will feel like backwards compatibility is necessary.
I certainly hope so, and I think that that Sony's got their head in the right space by making the announcement when they did, by bringing Cerny on board to talk about it, because gamers, the industry at large, trusts him to be the most reliable source of information about this. But we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see what they have to deliver us. Maybe by the end of the year, maybe by the next E3. Who knows when we'll get more information on the PS5. But in kind of lighter news regarding the Notre Dame Cathedral going up in flames, Assassin's Creed Unity just went...
Hang on, I just want to point out that the Notre Dame Cathedral going up in flames is not actually lighter news.
No.
But what you're leading into is, I know what you're trying to say.
Indeed, thank you, I appreciate the clarification. Lighter news regarding the tragedy. Because the world is kind of mourning right now, but Ubisoft has done their part as Parisians, as a French publisher developer, to kind of step in and help assist in the reconstruction efforts, which already billionaires and millionaires across the world have been doing. But Ubisoft has made a $500,000 contribution to the reconstruction efforts, as well as offered Assassin's Creed Unity for free on PC, and I promise I will not take this as an opportunity to bash Unity, because this is such a cool thing that Ubisoft is doing. And what we've noticed as well is that the game has actually been positively review bombed. This is something that we kind of touched on as something that was pretty unprecedented until we saw it happening with the older Borderlands titles after Borderlands 3 was announced.
Yes.
We touched on this in episode 1.
We did.
So this is kind of an interesting phenomenon. Do you think this is indicative of the future of user reviews?
I think that it might be the case for platforms like Steam and Metacritic, where review bombing has become sort of an established practice. Kind of positive review bombing is not really something that we've seen until very recently. It happened in the case of Metro Exodus, but into some sort of controlled conditions, and then it happened again with Borderlands in response to negative review bombing. This is the first time I think it's happened where there hasn't been negative review bombing in place to provoke it. This happened for kind of completely different circumstances. It's definitely a more positive story than the other cases, because those did happen in response to negative review bombing. Although it's a good thing that people are positively review bombing, I think it does highlight the fact that user reviews are increasingly becoming unreliable as an actual metric for a game's quality.
Yeah, certainly.
If they're going and positively reviewing the game because it's a good game, then great. But if they're giving it a positive review purely because of the circumstances surrounding this particular event, that's great, but it doesn't actually reflect the quality of the game, which is what the user review is supposed to be for.
Absolutely.
So I think it kind of highlights what we were saying back in episode 1, where these open user review systems are not really a good way of reviewing games, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting story specifically because we had touched on it in episode 1. And so it's something to keep your eye on for the future of user reviews.
I think it certainly could happen again now that it's happened a few times.
There's absolutely a precedent. But moving on from that short little story, you've got a dump of information regarding streaming in 2019.
It's
Go
my
ahead and lay it on
thing,
me.
Statistics.
Those spreadsheets.
Yes, Streamlabs and Stream Elements have both released their Q1 2019 reports for the streaming industry, which is basically charting a whole variety of trends on Twitch, YouTube Live, and Mixer, if anyone's paying attention to Mixer.
For the Mixer fan out there.
Hey, they've quadrupled their growth since Q1 of 2018.
What was that, from 1% to 4%? Is it?
Yes, so something like that. No, that's we don't want to spend the entire time bashing Mixer. It's a bit
No,
unfair.
this is not the topic.
But no. So yes, we've got two big new Q1 2019 reports, and there's some really interesting sort of factors that have come into play in the trends through Q1. And I think the two biggest stories are looking at the kind of clash between Apex Legends and Fortnite, which happened through Q1.
Ah, yes,
and
of course.
Also a very interesting bit of comparison between YouTube Live and Twitch. But we'll start with Apex Legends and Fortnite. So when Apex Legends launched back in February, obviously it shot to the top of Twitch's view rankings. Kind of exploded in popularity. I think at the time I think it almost doubled Fortnite's views in the same period, just for that initial burst, and everyone was looking at it and saying, is this going to be the big contender to Fortnite? And what we've seen now, looking at the Q1 trends, is that it really hasn't been. It came out of the gate sprinting, and it has since collapsed. So since its launch, I think by March it had already fallen back below Fortnite, and it's now sitting quite considerably below Fortnite, and it's still dropping. So at the moment, it looks like it's obviously still a successful game. It's not to say that it has not been very successful. It definitely has been, but it doesn't look like it's going to have the same kind of sustained popularity that that Fortnite kind of benefits from. And I think it's a bit it's a bit comparable to something like the difference between the Marvel and DC film franchises. Marvel comes out with a new film and it's just continuing what they've been doing before, and it's consistently successful, whereas DC does something like Justice League without doing all the back work of releasing stuff up to that point, and it kind of flops. And I think this is kind of what's happened with Apex, where nobody really knew what it was, so there was a big burst of excitement when it first released, and then everybody realized what it was, and a lot of people went off to do something else. And it has since kind of plummeted, whereas Fortnite was already popular for like the better part of a year. And what these trends, another aspect of these trends that they show is that Fortnite doesn't really seem to have been all that affected by Apex Legends' sudden rise in popularity. In fact, if I put up the relevant statistic, I believe it stabilized back to its pre-Apex Legends launch numbers within like a week or two of Apex launching. And since then it's been fairly stable, whereas Apex has been consistently dropping. So what that says to me is that the audience for Apex Legends was not necessarily pulled exclusively from Fortnite's audience. So you weren't necessarily getting gamers who were previously just watching Fortnite suddenly just watching Apex and now going back to Fortnite. I think that's kind of an oversimplification of the streaming audience.
So basically what I'm getting from this is that Fortnite cannot be killed, and any effort to do so is futile.
No. And that leads very nicely into the next point, which is that Fortnite is dying of its own accord.
Okay.
I don't think Apex is going to prove to be a Fortnite killer, as some people described it as. In fact, what we're seeing really with Fortnite is its own gradual decline, irrespective of Apex. Fortnite peaked back in Q2 of 2018 after its big rise in Q1. It shot up to almost 400 million viewing hours
Still
in that quarter,
staggering.
which is, I think, the most any game has ever had. But since then, it's been declining, and it's never reached that peak. So it fell down to about 370 in Q3, and then dropped to about 330 in Q4, and it's now dropped to about 270. So what we're really seeing, if you look at the data, is that the rate of decline from Q4, so back in sort of December-ish time last year, to now, has really been almost identical to the rate of decline from Q3 to Q4. So Apex Legends was certainly a factor, But
not a huge one, clearly.
no, I mean, it's hard to know exactly how much impact it had. We don't know, for example, if Apex hadn't launched, that Fortnite's rate of decline might have stabilized. So maybe it did have an impact in that regard. But just looking at the rate of decline, it really seems like it was going to decline to some degree anyway.
Yeah.
And there's a whole load of factors that could be at play there. You know, at the end of the day, people might just be getting bored with Fortnite, with other games releasing, especially with new games releasing in 2019. You know, Fortnite's only getting older, and although Epic Games is doing a good job of keeping it updated, you know, there's only so much they can do.
Stop it.
Exactly.
Right now.
People are eventually going to get bored and look for something else.
Yeah, and
so,
I think to me this is pretty indicative of the viewership and player base of each game. Right, Fortnite has been consistently primarily catered to and played by and watched by like teenagers, tweens, and kids, and they're gonna retain that viewership for as long as their respective attention span lasts. I mean, and then granted, that can be a long time, especially with a game like Fortnite that's evolving and changing.
Yeah,
and that's also not to say that all of Fortnite's viewers and players are kids.
No.
But that's certainly the majority. That's the audience that they cater to, and I think that again is indicative of the fact that Apex more seemed to attract people who saw another cool battle royale, but maybe had already left Fortnite months ago. And, you know.
But it's actually, there's another interesting part to this, which is that Fortnite may also be about to lose its top spot on Twitch. It's been the #1 most viewed game on Twitch for quite a while.
Too long.
I think for about a year. It was down below, or if we're looking at top publisher ratings rather than specifically the games, Epic Games has been higher than all of the other top publishers since Q2 of 2018. But if you look at the figures now, it's kind of slowly in decline, fairly consistently since Q2, whereas Riot Games has been rising since Q3. And is rising at almost the exact same rate that Fortnite is declining. And they're now
the MOBA.
really, really close. I think they're like within about 2 million hours watched of each other. And they're both, as I say, one's rising, the other's falling. So I think it's very likely, unless there's a big shake-up in streaming in the next quarter, that if we see these trends continue, Riot Games, and obviously that means League of Legends, is going to retake that #1 spot on Twitch for viewership. We're also seeing Valve is rising just underneath Riot, obviously with Dota 2 and things like that.
Dota and CS:GO gotta be,
yes.
Or Counter-Strike in general, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, this is also kind of indicative to me that you can't really kill the already big prevailing giants that have a huge international audience, because League of Legends has been championing the MOBA genre for years now. With
I'd say at least you can't
reach.
kill it with just one release.
No, certainly not.
It's going to take multiple factors over a period of time to bring a game like Fortnite down from its throne. And I think we're in a period where that is starting to happen. I think it's been sort of slowly happening for the last couple of quarters, and I think we'll see it a bit more pronounced in the next couple of quarters, because I've no doubt Epic will be attempting to find new ways to attract its audience to recover its numbers.
Yeah, and it's gonna be interesting how new audiences are either going to divert, and just keep going down the path they're going, or if they're going to be brought back in by their tactics. And finally, to kind of round the week out, you've got some news regarding Total Warhammer 2. I know there's Total War Warhammer 2. I know there's a bunch of stuff going down on that forefront.
Yeah, we'll just run through it pretty quickly. Yeah. So Creative Assembly released The Prophet and the Warlock, which is their newest Lord Pack DLC for Total War Warhammer 2. That came out earlier this week. Adds a new legendary lord to both the Lizmen and the Skaven, which is something that fans have been wanting for a very long time. Neither of those races have had like a really consistent update. since launch, so it's good to see them both getting a bit of attention.
Mm-hmm.
We also got a new free LC, which is always a good thing to see from Creative Assembly. They do like releasing their free LCs. And that adds another legendary lord to the Lizardmen, the fantastically named Tic-Tac-Toe.
That's excellent. That's good.
Yeah, he's great. And it's also interesting just because he's the second skink legendary lord alongside Ten Howen, who's also the new lord in Provident the Warlock. Up until now, they haven't had any skink lords, so a bit of interesting addition to the game. We also got a big game update on the same day that all this launched, the Doomsayer update. Made a whole load of balance changes. The campaign got some new regions, which is always interesting to kind of see them rebalancing the map, especially with the addition of new lords, because obviously they've got to find places to fit them on the map. We also got in that update a new rework for Britannia, which is kind of following on from their last big faction rework for Vampire Counts. Wasn't quite as big. We got a nice new kind of rebuild of the vow system, but we didn't get anything really big like the Vampire Counts got with their bloodlines. But Alberic's got his trident, so I think Britannian players should be happy.
So all is well in the world.
Yes. I think that was all the... it was initially released... we kind of assumed that the Under Empire and Croak mechanics were going to be in the new DLC. Turns out they're actually part of the Doomsayer update. So even if you don't get the Prophet and the Warlock DLC, the new Skaven Under Empire mechanic and the new mechanic for recruiting Lord Croak, they're available to all the Skaven and Lizardmen factions regardless, so that's all free. You can't blow up enemy cities as the Skaven without the DLC though. I think Croak can blow up cities just because he's Croak, but the Skaven Under Empire, they can do a thing where they can build essentially a warpstone powered nuke under a city and blow it up. But it's specifically Ikit Claw who knows how to do that, and he's the Lord in the DLC. So he's the only one who has access to that. I've put in a bit of time playing it, so I've experienced the Skaven Under Empire, and it's a pretty nice new addition. It's a big part of the lore, so it's nice to see the Skaven get that in this new update. I think it was a big thing that was kind of missing for their faction.
Nice. It's cool to see Creative Assembly add so much to their games,
at
one time.
The development team is really passionate about this game and about the lore, so it's always really nice to see them giving this big update with so many like fan favorite things coming in. But unfortunately for some fans, I'm sure many will be disappointed to find out that they came out shortly after the release on Reddit and confirmed that they will not be releasing any more any more Race Pack DLCs. There's only Lord Pack DLCs left for Total War Warhammer 2. I think so far they've released 2 Race Packs. I think it was Tomb Kings and Vampire Coast with the Race Packs for Warhammer 2, which I think brings the total number of factions to about 15. And so I'm sure people are going to be disappointed to learn that there's not going to be any more factions. I think the original game had about 4 or 5 that got added in DLC. So, it's a bit disappointing on that front. They have said there's going to be more DLC. It's just going to be more Lord packs, kind of like the Prophet and the Warlock, which I think is still great. There's a lot of potential for new content there. There's a lot of big characters in the lore who are not currently in the game. But I'm sure people who want to see things like the Ogre Kingdoms or Chaos Dwarves come to the game, they're going to be disappointed that there's no new races. However, it's not all that surprising because they're definitely working on the next game in the Total War Warhammer series, and we don't know exactly what form that's going to take, but they've already introduced the majority of the factions that existed in the tabletop war game.
Well, they've got to focus their efforts, so
Yeah, I mean, they added in 4 new factions with Total War Warhammer 2, and at this stage, I think there's only 2 factions that they haven't added in that actually had, like, full lines of miniatures, which is Ogre Kingdoms and Chaos Demons. And there's other factions in the lore, but most of those are very, very small, they never had official rules, or they never had any official miniatures, and so there's almost nothing to work with there. Not to mention the fact that Games Workshop, who kind of controls this franchise, really has no interest in reviving those parts of their really old editions.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's at all surprising that they're saying there's going to be no new races added to Total War Warhammer 2. I think it's interesting looking at what might potentially be in Warhammer 3. There's rumours that they might be taking it to the Age of Sigmar stuff, which I think that's going to be contentious among fans if it is.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll really have to wait and see about that, because they've not announced anything for Warhammer 3 other than it's presumably in development.
Yeah, I think we can trust Creative Assembly to do, given what they've done so far with Warhammer 2.
Yeah, certainly. They're certainly in tune with their fan base, which is always good to see.
That's important, especially for such a dedicated fan base.
Oh, very, very, very.
Well, that's going to round us out for the week. Thank you, for so much for tuning in today. You can find these stories and more at VGR.com. We're consistently looking for ways to improve the podcast, so if you've got any feedback or ways you think we could to implement, good changes, positive changes, please don't hesitate to leave your comments down below. We really appreciate it when we take time to look at and consider each one. Once again, I'm Jacob Smith.
I'm Matt Morgans.
And we will see you next week.